Hello, my name is David Charles Rowan, as you know. I'm an astrologer and teacher of astrology. Been teaching this for 33 years. And every year in January, I do a forecast of the UK. We look at economy, the monarchy, government, people, resources, conflict, all sorts of different stratas of uh, social life in our modern world. And we looked at, obviously, what's going to be happening politically. And you might know that while the commentators and even members of the the Tory cabinet all kind of thought that the election would be called for November, astrologically, it looked like it would be May, June, which is exactly what's happening. Called in May, happening in June. So the next thing is, who is going to win? We got an idea, yeah, but then everyone had the idea the election would be in November. So we're going to have an astrological look at things. Now, when I do the UK forecast, there's a piece of kind of looking at the British political system and also how it correlates with astrology at the beginning. And this takes about 15, 20 minutes, maybe a bit more. And to save time um, on doing this part of the process, uh, on the day that we look at the forecast for the election, I thought it might be an idea to kind of make a preview video that I can send to participants, and then they can have a look, and so they'll have this knowledge prior to what we do, and that will save a bit of time on the day. We can just launch straight into the astrology. But then I had a thought. Some of this might be interesting for people who aren't attending. You don't know. I don't know. But it begins with an overview of the structure of British politics as it is, well, at the moment. But this isn't the truth of the matter. It's my subjective opinion, right? So this is how it seems to me. Now, I haven't studied politics at university. I'm not involved in political activism. I've never been a member of any British political party or any political party of any country. I've never participated in a hands-on way with political things. I've only ever been on one protest march, and that was about the Badger Cull in 2012, the first one that took place in Bristol. But of all the things that kind of catch my attention and stir the pot within me and kind of cause outrage and and incredulity when looking at politics and things. None of it kind of prompts me enough to kind of go outside and march, largely because I've got walking disabilities. But in 2012, I was so uh, uh, distraught by what was going to happen to the Badgers that I went on that one. So, in terms of political activism and being involved in it, I'm an outsider completely, right? Just a member of the public who has a look and thinks, hmm. But the one thing that I do have, although I have never been a member of any political party, my voting, by the way, is inconsistent. So I don't vote for the same party every single election out of some kind of sense of loyalty or duty to a partisan viewpoint, right? I'm a floating voter in that sense. So I vote with where it feels best for me and best for what my agenda is. But I do have a consistent agenda, and that is fairness, right? I want life to be fair and balanced. I like the idea of peace. I like the idea of people being safe. I like the idea of competence. I like the idea of the machinery, the structure of civic society working well. You know, I like hospitals to work well. I like waiting times to be low. I like the police to be honest and efficient. I like the justice system to be fair and balanced, um, and swift. Things like that. Um, you know, So I also like the vulnerable to be cared for and looked after. Um, you know, just think about balance and fairness and kindness and compassion and tolerance. So now you can decide for yourself where you think that positions me politically. And where you think that positions me politically says something about your knowledge of politics, right? All I've done is describe some characteristics. Where that places me in the spectrum of left and right, you can figure that out. So, how a person might lean towards a certain political party is actually driven by their value system. Your own value system predetermines where your feet land, right? But this is where I think things are in the structure of things. Right, so I'm just going to put an image in the middle of the screen. Oh, by the way, you are here just for a bigger picture, by the way. We are on a rock hurtling around a huge lantern um, with a tiny little ball revolving around us. And this big ball of fire that illumes our world and gives us the heat, etc., that we have. This will implode upon itself in about 5 billion years. So, just to put things in a broader context, everything we're about to say about the political system is only temporary, um, because all things come to an end. Right now, you just had a flash of that for a second. This is how I see politics laid out. I don't see it as just a linear kind of line of left and right. I see it as an ellipse. So, for me, the back part of the ellipse is where extreme politics exists, where left blends into right. The front part of the ellipse is where moderate politics exists. This is also where left blends into right. But the left blends into the right in a moderate sense, or the left blends into the right in an extreme sense. So, in this moderate sense here, there is a democratic liberalism or a social liberalism. Where this blends into the extreme, you have National Socialism, so either communism or fascism, right? And then you have the kind of the moderate left wing over here and the moderate right wing over here. But let's explore all of these different parts in turn. So on the left of socialism, left wing politics, this is the politics of inclusion. So in the UK, this would be predominantly the Labour Party, sometimes called by people old Labour. People think of this as the traditional grassroots and ideology of left-wing politics. It's perceived as trade unions. It's perceived, in the media at least, as 1970s industrial disputes. It's perceived as compassion is more important than money. There's a part of this which could be described as Corbynism. When Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party was the biggest political party in the whole of Europe. That's changed since Corbyn wasn't there, but it was unelectable in England. Now, the reason it was unelectable in England is that the English tend to err towards uh, a more right-wing perspective. They mistrust socialism. The Scots don't. The Scots like socialism. They've got free prescriptions and things, free university education. You won't find that in England or Wales. Although the Welsh do tend to err towards the left as well. It's the English that are more right-wing as a totality. There's a reason for this, and it harks back to the Thatcher years. Right? Margaret Thatcher did a couple of things that were very canny in terms of prompting the English to vote Conservative in large numbers in an enduring way. One thing was that by, first of all, shackling the power of the trade unions and then beginning to dismantle the manufacturing base. So the mines like steel foundries, etc. So large communities found themselves unemployed. Now, the labor movement isn't just a political idea. It began as a group of workers. It was a community-based political notion. So in some of these uh, in manufacturing places, whole communities, whole cities, whole towns would grow up, and they would do things in unison. Like I remember in the 80s, I worked at a factory just outside Slough, and in this very large place that made bearings for boats and trains and things, there was a like a social club. And so after work, a lot of the people would go to the social club. Whole families worked in this factory, you know. So there'd be, a couple working at the factory. They met at the factory. Their children were working at the factory. Their parents were working at the factory. They'd all go to the social club on a Friday night. Some of them even grouping up to go on holidays together, right? So there was this community sense of things. Now, Maggie Thatcher famously said, there's no such thing as society, it's just individuals. And by trashing a manufacturing base, it fragmented the sense of community. So instead of people being kind of unified with the people around them in their local society, people started to find themselves more and more isolated socially. Right? Um, Another thing that took place, which was a very bright move on her part, but a devastating move sociologically for the country, was the selling of council houses. Now, as soon as people bought their own council house, suddenly they had a mortgage. And because suddenly they've got a mortgage, they're going to vote Tory. Now, that led to another very important thing, and that is um, uh, a lot of people know, of course, that a drain on the public purse is the welfare state. And a part of the drain, the welfare state is benefits, welfare benefits. And of course, nobody likes the idea of someone deliberately being lazy and not putting their contribution into society and just lounging about on benefits. But that's a very small percentage of the people on benefits, right? Nobody likes the idea of these deceitful people who pretend to be ill and then get large amounts of benefits when they're actually perfectly healthy. That's called a criminal. Criminals are not typical of any particular group, right? Criminals exist in every strata of life, from a golf club to a Morris dancing group to a rock band to a company. You'll find the potential for criminals who are self-serving in any strata of society. All right, but they're not typical of the whole of the group, are they? So I know that right-wing press like to portray the occasional misdemeanor, the occasional criminal, as if they're typical of whatever group it is, but they're actually not. That's just right-wing press for you, right? Now, in uh, if you look at the benefit system, what you'll find is that the largest kind of amount of benefit is in work benefits. What does that mean? In work benefits obviously means that people are claiming benefits while have a job. Whoa, while they have a job, there's a reason for this. The wages that they receive aren't enough to cover their basic needs to live. Well, and that didn't used to be the case. Uh, that's a new phenomenon. Where's that come from? Where's this in-work benefits thing come from? Because when I was growing up, there was people weren't having in-work benefits. Benefits was the safety net for people who've lost their jobs, right? Um, people would go to work and get their wages and kind of pay for their mortgage and go on holiday and things, you could live from your work. That was the idea of it. The idea that you do your work and you can't live, What's happened? One of the things that's happened is a thing that Margaret Thatcher did in, I think it was around 1988. There used to be a thing called the Fair Rents Act. And with the Fair Rents Act, if somebody wanted to rent out their house and be a private landlord, or maybe even just a room in their house, right, what would happen is that a member of the council would come round and look at either the room, the bedsit room, or they'd look at the whole house, depending on what's being offered for rent, and evaluate it. They'd evaluate what they considered to be a fair rent. And the rents were evaluated as being very close to what the rent would be if it was a council property. Right? And the rent was then capped at that level. So the private landlord was not allowed to charge tenants more than what had been agreed or dictated by the council. And so that meant if you were in the private rent sector, you'd be paying rent fairly close to the council amount, but a little bit more. That might mean that you've got some, additional perks. The place might be more plush than a council house might be, whatever reason you're in private rent, right? Now, Margaret Thatcher scrapped this, like I said, and I think it was about 1988. Within a month, landlords were rocketing up the rents. I remember there was a thing in a newspaper that was like an outrage, but also a thing of incredulity. Someone was renting out a garage in London for about £500 a week, and people thought this was madness. And it is indeed a madness because once that cap had been taken off the rents, rents skyrocketed, but wages couldn't keep up with them. So this meant that people were now going to work and they couldn't pay for the place they were living in. By the time New Labour got in, Gordon Brown created a thing called working tax credits. The idea being that if your work is below a certain threshold of wage earnings, then that means that you can apply for some benefit that would help basically top up your living and enable you to be able to manage. And that is in work benefits. And it's an absolute economic madness because all the people who go to work and pay their taxes, right, which is largely the people on PAYE, because the very wealthy find ways of avoiding paying taxes. And that's the biggest criminal thing of all, right? But still, by criminal, I mean unfair, immoral, unethical, right? Rather than illegal. Now, um, because of these in-work benefits, this means that people go to work, pay their taxes. A chunk of these taxes then go into the bank accounts of people on in-work benefits. But they don't go on holidays and buy a new set of golf clubs and kind of hang out with their chums and go to retreats. No, they have to give it to their landlords in order to be able to maintain where they live. The landlords then put the money into their pockets, and then it might even go offshore in wherever they happen to be investing or storing their money. So the private landlords are kind of reaping this huge pot of money and not necessarily spending it, depending on who they are. If they're professional landlords with multiple properties, obviously they would vote Tory, right? Then it serves them to keep the Tories in power because the people keep giving them the money, they keep pocketing it in their thing, the rich get richer, and it drains society completely. It's an absolute madness to do that. Now, if that was stopped, one of the reasons it isn't stopped is that if you suddenly put a rent cap back on, a lot of private landlords would stop being private landlords because there's no profit, right? What's the point of going through all the problem of having a house and you have to kind of get it sorted and you have to kind of sign all these things and there's all this bureaucracy that goes with it. And then you can have a tenant come into your place and if they're not very well mannered, they'll leave it in disrepair or a trashy mess, and you have to go through all of that process for virtually no profit at all. It's a lot of distress for not much reward. So you can imagine a lot of private landlords would just stop renting out. But if the private renting sector suddenly diminished, the homeless numbers would increase overnight because there aren't any council houses for people to live in because they all got purchased when Maggie Thatcher sold them. So to suddenly stop private rental would bring a juddering halt to people having somewhere to go. Yeah, and that's the dilemma. The only solution to that would be to build an excess amount of council houses and then introduce a rent cap so the people who no longer have rental properties, there's somewhere for them to go. But that would mean you'd have to have a government that would think like far ahead and explain to the country that this needs to be done, and then plow a lot of money into the project of doing that. But where would they get that from? Another one of the problems, of course, is that people pay tax on income, but not necessarily tax on wealth. Some people obtain their wealth without working for it. If they have large amounts of money, they just live off the interest. And so they continue kind of living a life of royalty and paying hardly any tax because their money is coming from interest, not from earnings. And so having just taxation based on earnings and not on wealth, property, or assets means that people who are exceptionally wealthy are hardly touched by taxation. But the people who have to go to work all the time are crunched by taxation. Hmm. Yeah. So anyway, just some ideas. But they're, like I said, they're only kind of my sort of notions of what I see happening. Now, so left-wing politics then, usually considered to be Labour, but we also have the SNP. Now, the Scottish Nationalist Party are a bit of an anomaly because most nationalist parties around the planet tend to be right wing, breakaway groups and things. They're very nationalistic, and nationalistic people are usually um, right wing. They don't like the idea of open borders and stuff like this. They just look after their group unit. But the SNP are odd because they behave like left wing socialists. Like I said, you can, if you visit a relative in hospital in Scotland, you won't pay for parking. If you need a prescription, you won't have to pay for it. If you want to go to university, you don't pay for it at the time that you're there. Um, mm. So they have some left wing ideas, even though they're a nationalist party. The Green Party. Now, the Green Party primarily are a party for the environment, right? The ecology. But the way that they talk about things, they do seem to be uh, leaning to the left. Right? They're closer to being in the middle and balanced, but given the choice of what they're talking about, when people corner them on question time, you know, um, then they do seem to have a left wing sort of leaning. The Lib Dems. Now, the Lib Dems, in their grassroots, are actually a little bit leftish. But of course, their theology is that they are in the middle. And then there's this thing that's sometimes called Blue Labour, Keir Starmer or Blairism, the PLP, which is the Parliamentary Labour Party. These are unpopular amongst party members, and they're often seen as anti-Corbyn, or even they declare themselves as anti-Corbyn. So the Labour Party grassroots are over here on the left-hand side. But the Labour Party that's putting itself up for election is here, closer to the right, but not completely in the middle. So they're slightly left wing, right? Why? Well, it's something that I think that Tony Blair observed before the creation of New Labour. In fact, I think it was prompted the creation of New Labour. And that is after the complete drubbing that Michael Foot got, and then the terrible kind of 1980s when Margaret Thatcher was getting re-elected and re-elected and re-elected, and Neil Kinnock was just getting nowhere against all of that. Part of the reason for that was that the right-wing press completely pushed out or pumped out the idea all the time that Labour is socialist, therefore that gets entwined with communism, which isn't correct. That's technically incorrect, right? Left-wing politics were over here, not over here, right? But there was a Cold War at the time as well. And so any kind of hint that anyone in the Labour Party had sympathies for the Soviet Union was considered to be unpatriotic and dangerous and things like this. So there was that kind of beneath the surface fear of extreme left wing ideas because of the Soviet Union, right? And so that made people fundamentally nervous about left wing things. And that also then tainted the Labour Party as well, because the Labour Party is a spectrum of membership, and some of them are Trotskyites, and some of them are very liberal. So Blair figured out that essentially, now that the English have got mortgages and council houses, it's going to be unlikely that they would vote for a socialist party. So the only thing you can do is make your socialist party appealing to the right. Not necessarily to the extent that you kind of become kind of grayed out in the middle. You still have your redness, but it has to be redness within the blue. Because if it isn't redness within the blue, you won't be voted into power. And that means you're handing over the reins of control to the right wing. If you have the reins of control and you're a little bit blue Labour, you have some say, you have some jurisdiction, you have some opportunity to help the vulnerable, to rebalance the rich-poor divide, right? If you have no control, if you have no hands-on power, then you have no opportunity to redress the balance of anything. And you have to wait another 5 years until you get possibly another chance. And that's what's been happening over the past 14 years. So Keir Starmer knows, because he's not silly, right? That in order to be able to have any say in what happens over the next 5 years in this country, you have to appeal to the people who would not trust someone so left wing that they appear to be dangerous, right? Not because they are dangerous, but I did say the word appear, right? Now, you might think, hold on a minute, are the British public so bamboozled by the press? Are they so gullible that they're taken in by this? Are they so swayed? There was one general election when I think it was a John Major one, but I'm not sure, where the Tories got in, and the next day the front page of the Sun newspaper was, "We did it." The Sun newspaper claimed credibility for having influenced the outcome of a general election. So you might think, well, this is only the Sun newspaper. I mean, that's not an important thing, is it? Print newspaper, blah, 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 blah. This island gave us Shakespeare. so far, over the last 400 years, the most beautiful exponent of the English language of any writer anywhere over 400 years. Right? Wow. And since this is the land of Shakespeare, when you look at it, the most popular, most read documentation on this island is the Sun newspaper and the Daily Mail, not Shakespeare. Populism is like that, right? So you have to appeal to the populist because if you don't do that, you're ignored. And we've had 14 years of common sense and fairness and justice being ignored. And I say common sense because you might know I've got a couple of master's degrees, an MA and an MSc. And you might think, oh, right, okay, so he's got a master's degree in astrology, he's got a master's degree in psychology, but I haven't. The MA was cultural astronomy and astrology, not looking at astrological technique, but looking at how astrology and astronomy influence and are played and interpreted through culture. Right? Like, for example, one person did a paper, I thought it was wonderful. One of my colleagues did a paper surveying children, asking, have you ever wished upon a star? If you have wished upon a star, did you know which star it was, the name of it, and did your wish come true? Just a wonderful little paper on how astrology or astronomy is, uh, you know, experienced in culture. My MSc, my Master of Science, wasn't in psychology, it's in psychosocial studies. Psychosocial studies looks at communities and groups and collectives through a psychotherapeutic lens. So it's, in a sense, it's a bit like the psychology of community, the psychology of movements of population. Okay. So it's both of those master's degrees, in a sense, are both, I guess, uh, sociology, right? Looking at the movements and groups and ideas of people. So that's what I love doing. I love looking at what's happening in the world and how ideas and trends flow and ebb and kind of change around. So stepping back from anything partisan, this is how things seem to me that this strand of the Labour Party, in order to be able to get any uh, thing to change, has to change itself in such a fashion that it becomes appealing to people who have been encouraged to be frightened of them. And in terms of, I mentioned about things being kind of crazy. I was in I was signing on one time in about 1990 or 91, I mean 1990. And in this queue, there was a thing in the newspaper about a gated community that had begun in the UK. And these very wealthy people purchased some properties, and there was like almost like a security guards and a gate, and they would check the identities of anybody who came in and out. And someone in his queue said, eventually, all the wealthy will live in self-made prisons, and the rest of us will be on the outside. And that was like this guy had this almost apocalyptic vision of the future of where things would go if the gap between rich and poor just continued to kind of widen. Eventually, you would have people in small enclaves with all these very starving, hungry people like savages on the outside, and they would have to live in spaces to protect themselves from the hungry. Right now, that's an extreme vision, isn't it? But is it? You know, um, when Labour were last in power in 2010, food banks were virtually unheard of. The idea that someone would have to rely on charitable food, that was, yeah, no, that only happened in very extreme, like circumstances. By the time, just before the pandemic, I remember there was on breakfast television, they were talking with a couple of ladies who were nurses, and they were nurses having to go to food banks. We were so uncaring of the people that care for us that they have to go to a food bank because we don't pay them enough, because we don't value them enough, because we don't value being cared for enough, because we don't value the system that cares for us enough. And when I say we, I mean the voting population, right? Because it's the voting population that predetermines the directions of these things. You know, there's a lot of people that don't vote. The people that don't vote are basically saying, I take my hands off of any responsibility, and whatever the voting people do, I'll go with it. Right? Now, that might be a protest in a sense, but the problem with that is that if a person doesn't vote and they don't participate in swaying the directions of things, what happens is that they create essentially a power vacuum. And then the extremists get in. You know that thing of never trust a politician because anyone who wants to be a politician wants to be in power, and never trust anybody who wants power, right? Well, when you don't vote, you allow the people that want power to get it in terms of the directions of things. So the people who are, excited and they have powerful agendas of left or right or middle or whatever or green, whatever, right? Whatever their political persuasion, when someone's very animated by it, when they're very keen on it, when they're almost obsessed about their political persuasion, they will go out and vote in all kinds of weathers, right? They'll get there. They'll make sure they put their X in the thing. They'll get their voice included. The people who aren't that kind of bothered about it won't put their voice in the box. So the boxes, the ballots that are counted, basically, they're the numbers of the obsessed, right? If you think of it like that. Now, do you want to let them decide how your society will flow? And then, of course, the next voice is, uh, they're all the same. Well, they all look the same. They all wear suits, don't they? You know, and they all go to the parliament. That's like saying chefs, they're all the same because they all wear white things, right? They all look the same. So therefore, every chef is the same. And all, music is all the same because everyone who plays a guitar looks like a person playing a guitar. So everyone who plays a guitar plays the same song. Um, hmm, okay. So in Parliament, then suits, that's the uniform of it, right? But just because they look the same, it doesn't mean they are the same. There's one subtle thing that illustrates for me the difference between the two. Before child tax credits, there used to be child benefit. And child benefit used to be paid to the head of house. So in most domestic environments, that meant that the money was paid into the bank account of the man. This meant that if there was a situation of domestic abuse and a woman was being intimidated or bullied by the man of the house, when the money went into his account, he could spend it on the horses. He could spend it down the pub. He could use it as a lever to get her to do things. Otherwise, I won't give you the money. And then she'd have to watch her child starve. Right? There are some men who are nasty enough to do that. Honestly, there are. I know it's unpalatable. And you might think, whoa, hold on a minute. Surely no human being could be that cruel. But that's not anywhere near the nth degree of the cruelty of possibilities in human behavior. So when Gordon Brown created working tax credits, he also created child tax credits or child benefit credits thing. I can't remember the name of it, but you know what I mean. And he changed it. He adjusted it so that the money for children would go to the woman's bank account. And that meant that now a woman has an independent income stream. She's in control of what she does with that, which means she can't be now kind of manipulated or kind of maneuvered uh, or coerced through economic pressure as much. And that meant that women had a little bit more power, a little bit more leverage in the direction of their own lives. That's been kind of taken away now and replaced by universal credit, a Tory idea. Universal credit, guess what? The money goes to the head of house. They changed it back. It's a subtle little thing, isn't it? It's a tiny little insignificant thing. But the impact on some people's lives is incredible. So you find that if you think of society as an economic strata, right? So you've got like the very wealthy at the top and the very, very vulnerable at the bottom. And so like everyone else is sort of in the middle, right? For most people, the people who are sort of in the middle, it doesn't make that much difference, I guess. You know, there might be a change in the amount of potholes. There might be a bit of a change in the school curriculum. There might be a bit of a change in, how many wind farms there are, but it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. If you're at the very top of the economic strata, it makes a massive difference, right? But it also makes a massive difference if you're at the very bottom, because the people who are most vulnerable, certain changes in policy can literally mean the difference between life and death. When Cameron got in 2015, for about 3 days, I was overwhelmed with messages and phone calls from people in my Facebook network who are disabled, terrified at what this means for them. Because they'd been experiencing for a couple of years before that with the ATOS process, people with medical conditions being evaluated by non-medical people. Like for some reason, people don't trust doctors anymore, right? As if doctors give out fit notes and things and tell you that you're not able to work because they're your chum, right? Rather than because it's actually a medical diagnosis. So these non-medical people were evaluating medical conditions, and some disabled people were having their mobility scooters and things taken away, which meant they were basically put under house arrest. And they were terrified because people who vote Tory basically say, we don't care about you. And that means that the community around you is like a sea of sharks. Could you imagine what it would be like to be physically vulnerable or mentally vulnerable or both? And to live in a world where you know that your neighbors care so little about you that you could be housebound and starving and they don't give a toss. That would be terrifying, wouldn't it? That's what happens when people vote Tory. That's how it feels in that world, right? And I think that's unfair. Just an evaluation that I have, right? So we have the middle, Liberal Democrats ideology. So the Liberal Democrats' grassroots might be slightly left, but the way that their ideology comes out is, their policy documents and things, they try to be as equally favorable to compassion as they are equally favorable to the finances. Um, on the left, the Socialist Workers' Party are further left than Labour, and communism, of course, begins to go towards the extreme, and then its behaviour, it kind of meets uh, National Socialism. So, if you looked at the uh, what was happening to the population in the Soviet Union under Soviet rule, especially under Stalin, you find that wherever there are, communism in charge, there's totalitarianism. And wherever you have totalitarianism, you have members of your own population being incarcerated without trial and murder and things like this corruption is just the de rigueur, really. It's the order of the day, whether it's left-wing based totalitarianism or right-wing based totalitarianism, the behavior appears to be the same. On the right, then, in the UK, we have the Conservative Party. These are known as Tories. Their traditional rank and file and ideology, they're normally called the rank and file. They're perceived as 1922 backbenchers. They have a committee, 1922 Backbench Committee. There are other ones now, the ERG, the people who are kind of against Europe and things like this. But they're perceived to be toffs and old money. They appear to have an idea, a kind of like a morality of money is more important than compassion. Thatcherism is the thing that makes Tories go dewy-eyed and long for the wonderful days when Thatcherism is a ghost that casts its shadow over the Tory party for many decades. It's very popular in England, um, or it has been. Now, the UK government, Sunak, is perceived. There's a friend of mine who lives in Sheffield who came out with this wonderful term for Tories. He called them the self-servitists. And I think that's a brilliant name, the self-servitists. These people seem to have an untouchable wealth. They're also seen to be incompetent and untrustworthy. Now, there were people, or there are, I'm not sure if it's were or are now, because the rats have been leaving the sinking ship recently. But Michael Gove had an advisor called Cummings, who ended up being Boris's advisor. And through the advice of Cummings, there was an educational document that seemed to be supporting eugenics. Eugenics is a belief system that in the human population, there are different qualities of gene. This idea came from a guy called Galton, who was a half cousin of Charles Darwin. And when Darwin published his works on natural selection, Galton thought, I wonder if this applies to humans. He did hundreds of sketches, pencil sketches of human faces, what he considered to be disfigured faces. And he decided that there were kind of different qualities of gene in the human gene pool, and that the human gene pool would benefit if these less quality genes were removed. Now, that idea kind of went across the world. And so it fed into the cultural divisions in America, the racism. It fed into Nazi Germany, obviously, the idea that there are inferior genes and you can only have a proper humanity if you get rid of them, right? But it's also kind of reappeared again since the emergence of genetic engineering, you know? So eugenics, this notion that there are superior genes and inferior genes, fits into right-wing ideology. You might have heard of a phrase that some people who vote Tory actually say, right? And that is they call the general population the great unwashed. There was a comment from a Tory MP in the 80s who said he didn't like public transport because he had to sit on a bus with all those human beings. Makes you wonder what he thought he was, really. Yes. Compassionate conservatism, or Cameronism. Uh, this was an idea that was kind of espoused by David Cameron. Now, whether or not the behavior met the language is another thing. But it was under his tenureship that gay marriage came about, which was unpopular amongst the rank and file Tories. They didn't like it. Brexit was kind of well received on the right, which I think is one hell of a huge mistake. Cleggism, the Lib Dems were popular uh, or at least he was popular until the coalition. But they're also perceived as treacherous and untrustworthy because of their position of scrapping tuition fees prior to the 2010 election, and then the then tuition fees not being scrapped after the election. So they were seen as being, untrustworthy what they were saying. Now, okay, let's see what else we have now. There's something else. Oh, yes, UK Brexit Party. Now this is known as Reform as well. There's another one in here. UK's changed its name to the Reform Party. They're more extreme than the Tories. Right? And then, of course, you get more extreme than that. British kind of correlations with Nazism would be the BNP, British National Party, the EDL, the English Defence League, NF, the National Front, and column 88. The eighth letter of the alphabet is H, so C88 is CHH, which is Heil Hitler. Those are the extremes, and of course, then that leads into National Socialism. So this is how I kind of see the British political structure. Right? Um, yeah. Now, I would love to hear from you if you think that any of the layout here, where I've positioned things, is correct, incorrect, on target, off target, way off, really close, whatever, you know. Yeah, I know that the whole thing is all a big balancing act, trying to make sure that everyone feels that they're being treated fairly is not an easy thing when you have a wide, diverse population. But I think that the mark of a civilization is to look at how it treats its vulnerable. And I just like the idea of the most vulnerable being cared for because everyone else they're big enough to take care of themselves, you know? Just an opinion. But then I would have that opinion because I grew up with a disabled mum and I watched her die slowly over 10 years when I was 10 years old. So I do like the idea of the vulnerable being cared for. It's just a thing, you know. Yeah. But then I'm vegan as well. I say I love animals and I live that so strongly that I don't eat them. Yeah. Uh, I think, yes, I like to be congruent to my belief system. Not everyone does. I understand that. But, now, another thing that I noticed in an astrology class I had, uh, I think it would be about 2009. In fact, it was 2009. Quite often in my pre-online days, when I used to teach astrology in my house, so people would come once a month and we'd have a whiteboard and we'd kind of draw astrological things on the whiteboard during the class. But it was always blank at the beginning of a class. Except one day, I just about an hour or so before the class, I realized that I'd been politically active for 30 years. And I've been politically active for 30 years. And then I wondered something. See, this planet here, Saturn, the one with the rings of ice around it, Uranus has rings around it as well, but they're not as well publicized, harder to see, you see. Um, but if you've got a good pair of binoculars, you can see the rings around Saturn just about through a pair of binoculars. Anyway, um, Saturn takes 29 and a half years to orbit the sun and go all the way around. So that's just about 30 years. So, you know, every 28 days or so, 20 and a half days, the moon goes around the earth and people have a tidal experience. The sun takes a year to go around, or rather, the earth takes a year to go around the sun, but it seems to us that we have our solar cycle, our seasons, and once a year you have a thing called a birthday, when the sun returns to occupy a portion of the sky that it was in when you had your very first breath. And in astrology, that's called a solar return. So every 28 and a half days, the moon returns to a position every solar year. the sun returns to a position. Every 30 years, Saturn returns to a position, that position being the start point, wherever that was, right? So I thought, hold on a minute. I've been politically active for a Saturn cycle. I wonder if there's anything in there. And I started to kind of look at it and found that there are some correlations, right? When Maggie Thatcher came into power, uh, we were experiencing in the UK what has often been since been called the winter of discontent. Lots of municipal workers and public sector workers went on strike. There were piles of rubbish in the streets because there were no one collecting rubbish. There were strikes everywhere. Even grave diggers went on strikes. So bodies were being piled up, right? Maggie Thatcher came in on that kind of basis. Then Saturn went into Libra. And one of the things that Maggie Thatcher did during Saturn being in Libra was that she readdressed or sought to readdress the power relationship between management and unions. Ended up kind of crushing the unions as a result of that. Maggie Thatcher got into power again, principally on the back of the Falklands War, because patriotism kind of basically ushered her back into number 10 again. But during that time of Scorpio, Saturn going through Scorpio, there were all sorts of power dynamics going on in British society. One of the things that was taking place through that period were there were strikes at Wapping print newspapers being taken over by digital processes. There were minor strikes. British police were literally behaving like they were, the enforcers of the political system or the armed forces of political system. They were running battles between police and just men who are, protesting about work. Dreadful state of affairs, almost using the police like the armored wing of a political movement, which is the conservatism of its time. Then, there was a clampdown on the movement of population as well. Famously, there was the Battle of the Beanfield, a punch-up between police with truncheons and things, and just other people who lived in mobile homes and caravans who happened to be parked up near Stonehenge at the time. There was a clampdown on movement in lots of ways. Oddly enough, even people who lived on water, knew people who lived on boats, canal boats, and they could go up and down the canals as they wished and live on the waterways. All of a sudden they were told that they have to declare a mooring space and stay there. And they could move maybe 2 or 3 spaces either direction, but they had to kind of stay in that locality. So there was a kind of movement around that. Then Saturn went into Capricorn. Margaret Thatcher was still in the beginning of that. But during that period of time, well, when Saturn went into Aquarius, John Major came in. They got rid of Maggie, and John Major became the Prime Minister. He was the Chancellor before that. He managed to secure another election. But during that period of time when Saturn was in Pisces, there was a huge financial crash, which is often called a Black Wednesday, I think it was called. And then Saturn went into Aries, and Tony Blair swept in. Tony Blair was Prime Minister all the way through. I find it interesting that the last time that he was Prime Minister, Saturn was in Leo, a sign of dramatic expression. Gordon Brown became Prime Minister 30 years after Thatcher got in, when Saturn was in Virgo. His tenureship was kind of upset, if you like, by, I guess, scandals within Parliament itself. People, the expenses scandals and things. And so there was a lot of internal navel gazing and correcting of structures, correcting of procedures when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. When he ended, Saturn was in Libra, and there was a balance, there was a partnership when Saturn was in Libra. And I can remember writing to someone and saying that my Facebook posts were going to change in 2011, the end of 2011. So my Facebook posts are going to change next year. They're going to be less spiritual and more political. And so the person said, why? I said, because Saturn's going to go into Scorpio. Saturn was in Scorpio at the same time as Pluto in Capricorn. This meant that the planet that represents politics, Saturn or government, is going to go into a sign of extremes. And the planet of extremes, Pluto, is in the sign of government and economy, which suggests that not only could there be financial collapse, but also that politics would become more extreme. It would become more polarized, which is exactly what happened. Saturn in Sagittarius, the fixation on British politics at that time was on foreign affairs. Saturn in Capricorn, Boris, the fixation is on what's happening with the rules and the laws. Boris Johnson obviously breaking rules and breaking laws all over the place. You know, Boris Johnson, the only person, the only British Prime Minister to have been found guilty by the police of a something. Rishi Sunak, now British Prime Minister, again, the only person who's been found guilty of a something while in office. Yes. Liz Truss, the Saturn in Aquarius, a sign of madness and eccentricity. Liz Truss, goodness me, the crazy experiment. And I really did like the lettuce thing that the Star newspaper did. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the Star newspaper, for a bit of fun, took a photograph of a lettuce and they put it on a mantelsill, on a windowsill or something, and said, "We believe that this lettuce will survive or outlive the premiership of Liz Truss." And 47 days later, Liz Truss was no longer prime minister, and the lettuce had not yet decomposed. So she was outlived by a lettuce. But Rishi Sunak, now Rishi Sunak lost the leadership contest to Liz Truss, but then suddenly he was shoehorned in. And what next? Saturn's in Pisces at the moment, and politics appears to have got lost in a fog of confusion. And it's within the atmosphere of this fog and conclusion that Rishi Sunak is going to be changed or to who? Um, could he continue? Maybe. Could he be replaced by somebody? Maybe. Can we work out who that is? Maybe. Well, definitely. We'll have a look. So that sets up the frame of what we're going to be exploring a little bit on when we do the UK election astrology. Okay. I cannot remove myself from my own brain. So I'm not the BBC. I don't have a legal remit to be balanced. So I'm a person, which means I have biases, I have balances, and I love the idea of fairness, and I really dislike the idea of unfairness. So what I consider to be fair, what I consider to be unfair is a personal lensing, right? So when you come along to a political thing with me, you it's always going to be kind of leaning towards the left because I lean towards the left. That's just me, right? Other astrologers are available. I'm quite sure. When I was doing a term of social psychology at Cheltenham Uni, we were looking at how psychology is used and psychology information is used by different parts of society. And there was uh, a bunch of people, eugenics, kind of convention, if you like, and they were talking about psychology and things. And the leader of the BNP was one of the keynote speakers, right? Because data from statistics, data from experiments, data from research is a phenomena, but that phenomena has to be read. And that means that all data is interpreted, and it's interpreted by a human being, right? So no matter how clinical the experiment, whether it's in physics or chemistry or biochemistry or sociology, whatever field, if you've got data, that data is then read. And that means it's read through the lensing of a human psyche. And that means it's read through the lensing of human biases and emotion and the mood of the moment. You know, if they've had a good morning or a bad morning, that'll have an effect on how the data is read, right? Because we're human beings. And so, um, for every kind of thing that comes out of a neuroscience lab that supports altruism, there's another bunch of people who use the same data to support their case for eugenics. One of my favorite authors of the moment is a guy called Louis Cozolino, who's a psychotherapist and neuroscientist in America. And his third edition of the fantastic Neuroscience of Psychotherapy has a section in it on uh, brain dynamics of right-wing thinkers and the brain dynamics of more liberal thinkers who support altruism and the brain health of the two. Fascinating read, right? But I like that. I like the idea that neuroscience supports the idea of it's healthy as a human being to care for people, even those you're not related to, because it's a beautiful thing to do. Anyway, we're going to have a look on the 2nd of June and see where this country's going to go, right? And just to find out if we can get the flavor of that or the hint of it through the lensing of astrology. Okay, I have no idea how long this thing's gone on for. Thank you for having the patience to kind of sit through this, but please write to me. Let me know what you think of this, right? And I'm okay about being criticized. I'm okay about, people kind of arguing with my ideas. But I do like kindness and politeness and courtesy. So if you can be polite and courteous, but still tell me my ideas are wrong, that's fantastic. All right. Okay. You take care. See you soon. Oh, by the way, if you tell me my ideas are wrong, I'd like you to give your reasoning as well. Let me know what it is about my ideas that are wrong and how they could be improved, because guidance is always welcome. All right. Take care. See you soon. Bye.